An infection that never ends. First, you suffer from the coronavirus. And then, the body, especially the nervous system, the brain, everything stops working. Brain fog, a symptom of long COVID, the illness after the illness. But it hasn't just been around since the coronavirus pandemic. MECFS, myalgic encephalomyelitis with chronic fatigue syndrome, has been known as a medical phenomenon since the 1950s. Hardly anyone in the population knows about it, except those affected. And there is no help. Professor Martin Korte is researching how diseases triggered by infections with viruses or bacteria which are not actually intended for the brain can affect it, what role infections play in neurodegenerative processes, and how Alzheimer's and dementia actually develop. He heads the Neuroinflammation and Neurodegeneration research group at the HZI in Braunschweig. In this episode of InFact, we talk about these two important and exciting things, and at the end, you will find out what we can do to keep as much of our brain for as long as possible.
Yeah, we are here in the library of the HZI, and joining me today is Professor Martin Korte. He leads the Neuroinflammation and Neurodegeneration research group at the HZI. Thank you for talking to me and take your time to speak with me. Among other things, you're studying infections and memory. How can infection outside the brain affect cognitive function at all?
I think it's not a surprise to everybody that when you are ill, your brain is also not functioning normally. You cannot learn when you are seriously ill. You have a hard time to memorize something. You try even to stay out of social contact. You prefer to be in bed, and you do not prefer to think when you are seriously ill from an influenza infection, as an example. And I think that shows already that an infection, of course, affects the brain. It's probably even an evolutionary function that the brain reacts to an infection, because it also keeps you away from other people, and also it helps you to save energy, which the immune system at that time actually is needed. But what we discovered is that the brain is longer affected by an infection than, for example, the lung. So, which means that 60, 90, even sometimes 120 days after an infection, we can still learn less good than we could before. We could think less good than before. And that's due to the fact that the inflammatory response in the brain is still going on. Whereas the rest of the body already is completely normal again. The immune system is silent. And in the brain, the immune cells of the brain, the so-called microglial cells, are still active. And it's not clear why, but even in young age, it can last for a longer time than the infection itself.
But does the brain recover from such effects, or can the consequences be even in long term?
It's an important point you are raising. When we are young, let's say below 40, it usually recovers very quickly. There's an exception, which we all know is long COVID, but let's leave that aside for the moment. Normally, the brain recovers completely in 60, 90, probably 100 days. When we get older, it's different. When we get older, the brain might not recover at all. And after a serious influenza infection, it could be that our memory is less good than we were before the infection when we are of old age, let's say 60, 70, 80. That's why I always emphasize when we get older, we need a vaccination against influenza. And now one can also say we need a vaccination against the coronavirus, and we might even need it every year. At the beginning of the vaccination against the SARS-CoV-2 virus, people thought probably once is good because the virus is not mutating so much, but that the virus proved us wrong, our scientific assumption. So it actually has lots of variants, and we need, when we get older, definitely an upgrade of the vaccination process. And there's a nice thing, you can do it at once. In the left arm against influenza, in the right arm SARS-CoV-2. The next year you do it the other way around. and that actually helps against not the infection itself, but that the infection gets serious. And this is a problem for the brain. It's not the infection itself. It's when when it is a strong response of the immune system, then our brain might be affected, and it might be affected for a long time.
Okay, but as we age, memory naturally declines and learning becomes difficult and stuff like this. I would have said this is simply a normal part of aging, but how often this happens due to infections?
Yeah. What you say is what people, even in the scientific literature, thought for a long time. We just age, the brain gets older, and the memory is deteriorating. And that's just a genetic fact of life, of aging. And actually it turned out not to be true. 80% of our brain power is determined by how we live, how much we learn, how much we do exercise, what we eat, and indeed, how many serious infections in our lifetime we had, how often the immune system was stimulated in a strong way. So in that sense, also infections do not determine, but do influence how fast our brain is aging. So this deterioration of memory, the decline of memory is not a natural giving. So if we do learning even at older age, if we exercise at older age, if we get our vaccination every year, the deterioration of memory is a lot slower than it is in people who don't get a vaccination, probably even smoke, drink alcohol. Then the brain is aging a lot faster, and also the risk factor for neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer and Parkinson is increasing.
Yeah.
So basically, whatever not protects us from aging, but whatever is good in order to have a brain that ages slower is also something that reduces the risk of becoming seriously ill. So actually, in a double sense, we do us good.
Yeah.
So we have a better functioning brain when we age, and we avoid diseases, or at least we get diseases many, many years later.
The diseases you called, Alzheimer's, for example, this is also a field that you are researching. But what exactly happens in the brain in these diseases?
Let's take Alzheimer as an example. During the Alzheimer disease, we have extracellular plaques. They are called beta plaques, small proteins that clump together and that trigger a process that leads to, we call it hyperphosphorylation, which means the changes in the molecular composition of molecules that are inside neurons. And they are very important for the infrastructure of neurons, for the mobility inside neurons of organelles and of molecules. These are the so-called microtubules. They get stabilized by a molecule that is called tau. And this tau molecule can also clump. So we have extracellular clumps of proteins and intracellular, and that kills neurons. This is what we observe. We're just wondering, why do they exist at all, and why do some people have them and some people don't? And it seems to be the case that the occurrence of the plaques and how toxic they are is also influenced by inflammatory processes. And we do have our own immune system in the brain. They're called microglia cells, and these microglia cells can actually also do something to the molecular composition of the plaques and make them more toxic if they react for a long time. And the older we get, if the microglia cells are stimulated, the harder it is to turn them off again. So one thing that happens during aging is the inflammatory response in the brain is starting, but it's not stopping anymore. This is called senescence of the microglia cells. They become older and they are less good to regulate. It would be like if we turn up our smartphone, if we turn up the music and we cannot turn it down again, that's a serious problem.
Yeah.
And the same in the brain for the inflammatory response. It would be like an inflammatory response in the skin. The skin is getting red. After some days, it's normal again. But if that is not turned off again, the skin is damaged in a way that it cannot be repaired anymore. And the same is happening in the brain.
But how do you study the impact of infections of our brain function?
In order to study that, we need animal models. In this case, we need the mouse. Why? We have very standardized conditions. We know precisely the genetic composition of these mice. They get precisely something to eat. We give them, they have a 24-hour day, they have enough fluid to drink. So we can determine everything very precisely. And then we can look at a so-called model for the Alzheimer's disease. So these mice are genetically altered that they have a high likelihood of becoming Alzheimer's disease. And then we can compare them to control litter mates. Same conditions, just they don't get Alzheimer. And then we can infect the Alzheimer model mice with influenza virus and can see, and actually that's actually what we saw, that there's an increase in mice who get Alzheimer at a younger age, more serious. They even react to the infection in a much more serious way in comparison to the control groups. And that's how we study this. And then we make assumptions, we make new experiments. What can we do to prevent that? For example, if we vaccinate the mice, the Alzheimer model mice, the risk of becoming Alzheimer at even younger age than they would get it anyway is reduced. So we can look for certain biomarkers that are available in the blood that actually are a sign of getting the disease earlier. And this usage or this knowledge we can use for humans. We can for human studies, because an animal model is an animal model, so it's still a model. So in the end, we need to prove our data in the real world, in our body. And for that, this animal research is of tremendous importance.
Okay. When I look into our society, we are getting older and older. We also have a growing number of people vulnerable to infections and neurodegenerative diseases. What does this mean for us as a society?
For us as a society, it means we need to be aware of that the aging society also has costs. It's not only good, and one of the costs that we need to keep in mind is that the number of people with Alzheimer's disease is increasing. We know worldwide we have in the moment 27 million people affected by Alzheimer's. This number will increase by 2050 to more than 150 million. So that also means we have the same problem in Germany. The society is aging, so if we don't do anything, we have more people with Alzheimer's disease, which is a huge burden. Everybody else, for the family, but also for us as a society, because Alzheimer's disease is a very expensive disease. It takes 6 to 12 years where people need care. Very expensive care, 24-hour care. So we need to do something to avoid that or to delay the disease onset, either with better research leading to new medication to therapy. But the good thing for us as a society is, at least in principle, it would be, or it is a good thing, or it could be a good thing that actually we can do something ourselves. For example, exercise reduces the risk. To learn something, interestingly, reduces the risk, because the brain, when we learn something, builds new neurons, new synaptic connections, and all this can be used as a compensatory power. If something in the brain dies, if we have a higher level of neurons or of synaptic connections, then we see the effects, the cognitive effects of this disease a lot later, up to 7 years later. That's a huge difference.
Yeah.
So exercise, learning, also eating healthy. Best is to avoid obesity. Obesity is a huge risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. Also, what people always underestimate is to have a functioning hearing system. So if you lose part of your hearing, it's actually a risk factor for Alzheimer, because in a social sense, you become isolated.
Yeah.
And social contact is a huge stimulus for the brain, and whatever stimulates the brain leads to the release of neuroprotective factors, of so-called neurotrophins, which we also study. And they protect neurons, they protect the brain to function for a longer time period. So this is what we as a society need to keep in mind. We can do something ourselves, and we need more research for the origin of the disease, for the therapies, because in particular for Alzheimer's disease, our therapy is almost absent. We have now 3 antibodies that delay the disease for a couple of months and which have side effects. So we need to get much better. We need more research in order to get better therapies.
Yeah, because you can't, or actually in this moment, it's not possible to cure these diseases. Yeah. So could better treatment and prevention of infectious diseases also reduce the burden of neurodegenerative diseases?
That's at least the hypothesis that comes out of our research. So we think one of the risk factors for Alzheimer's disease is a huge immune response, and the huge immune response you get when you get a viral infection, or at least for some viral infections. So whenever we can prevent them, either avoiding them by better filtering the air, making sure that people with a viral infection stay at home and work from home if possible, or they're simply sick and should stay at home and not go to work. And we need vaccination against every virus one can think of. And if there's a vaccination available, we need a society who's willing actually to take the vaccination, for example, against influenza or also now against SARS-CoV-2. And the older we get, the more important it is to get these vaccinations, because, in my opinion, serious infection is also a risk factor for the brain.
Yeah, so we talked a lot about older people and their risk with infections for the brain. But what about younger people as we think about long COVID or something like this?
If people have a SARS-CoV-2 infection called COVID-19, very often in these days it is very mild. You have a headache, you are ill for a week, and then basically you go back to work. But in 3 to 6% of these people, 2 weeks later, it kind of hits them again. They kind of get in a brain fog. Memory is working less good. They might even get a fatigue syndrome and they cannot move at all. They need to stay in bed. Everything is extremely exhausting, even thinking, not only walking. And as this is called long COVID, I prefer to call it long virus, because it can also happen after an influenza infection. It just needs to be a strong stimulation of the immune system, which might affect the brain for months, sometimes years. And even if you lose your sense of smell, that's quite a burden of people if you can't taste the food you are eating. So it's very distressing.
Yeah, and it's even a little bit of a little danger. Yeah, if you can't smell if food is good.
Yeah, one thing. And another thing is memory is affected. So a viral infection can lead to a long-lasting activation of the immune system in the brain, and that then can affect neurons in different parts of the brain in the way that our sensory systems is deteriorating, our memory is not as good, we cannot work as efficiently as we could before, and in particular for my students, they cannot learn as good as they would be. And this affects also young people, and you might also be affected if the original infection with the SARS-CoV-2 virus is rather mild. And that's why for my people it's clear at my working space, if people have a SARS-CoV-2 infection, they stay home, they work from home, even if they don't feel seriously ill, in order to avoid affecting other people who might then be affected by long COVID.
Which role does long COVID research play in your research?
We do research here at the HZI with different viral strains in different mouse models in order to understand why the SARS-CoV-2 virus is so much more dangerous for long-term effects. And of course, then how can we prevent it? Would a vaccination prevent it? We have preliminary results that actually does help to reduce the risk of getting long COVID. It might also be that other therapeutical interventions might help, anti-inflammatory agents in the brain. Also, some autoantibodies might play a role, so it seems to be also partly an autoimmune response. And then the nice thing is the SARS-CoV-2 research that we are doing could actually help to understand autoimmune diseases in a much better way, because there seems to be a link between long COVID and autoimmune diseases. So it might also be of advantage for other research areas, because until a couple of years ago, autoimmune research was not very well developed, was not very well understood. And we get a huge boost from one research area to another. We are working together with people we have never imagined before. So that's one of the stimulus and one of the interesting things of doing science, of always connecting new things to one another.
Yeah, I think you love your work, you love your job, but you're also a human being. So you have to sleep, you have to do some, maybe you want your private life. What do you do to calm down, to relax? What do you do in your private life?
Yeah. I like traveling. Luckily, my whole family, my wife and my 2 sons do as well. I like reading. And also I like to do sports. My whole life I was a sports person. First I played soccer, and after I ruined my knees, I switched to a bicycle. So I bicycle to work. When I go upstairs, I don't use the elevator, I use my legs. So I try to not relax, but I try to live a healthy life also in terms of what I eat, or actually what I don't eat. On the other hand, I must also say I also like good food. I like to enjoy things. So I think it's always a balance between staying healthy but still laugh, play, and eat well. I think that needs all come together, and that's so the kind of balance I try to do. For example, on the downside, I don't sleep enough. That's one of the burdens of trying to have a private life and work a lot at a certain stage. Also, my day is only 24 hours. And actually not getting enough sleep is also a risk factor of getting a neurodegenerative disease. So this is something I need to work on. But in the moment, that's one of the downsides of being a scientist and trying to have a private life.
Yeah, but you can have all. So as a take-home message, what can we all do to keep our brains fit for as long as possible?
I think it's just a reminder of what people already know. Exercise, 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 and build the exercise in your life, because we all knew it's good to exercise, and normally we do it for a day, and then on the 2nd of January we start to forget. So we need to implement exercise in our life. Put your jogging shoes in front of your door. Put your bicycle in front of your car. If you are in a building, don't use the elevator. And always try to have friends who do the same, because we are much better to do things in groups and exercise it. Play with other people, games. Cook with them, meet other people, because that's meeting other people, having a social life is demanding for the brain, and everything that is demanding for the brain is actually good for the brain. And learn something. And learning does not mean you learn something you hate. If you travel, you learn actually a lot. So do something that you like to do, but learn. Eat well, but eat healthy, and try to avoid unnecessary calories. For example, when you drink something, drink water, or at least be aware if there's sugar in what you are drinking. Many people, when they buy an orange juice in the supermarket, don't realize that the sugar in that orange juice is as high as it would be in a Coca-Cola.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean. So eat healthy and try to meet other people, exercise. This would be my take-home message.
Thank you very much, and thank you for telling me what happens in neurodegenerations as a whole. It was very, very interesting. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.